Well, good morning, subscribers. It's been a while since I uploaded a video, and today I'm looking at the most recent David Smith Sunday Times article from the 10th of May, so it was just yesterday, where the title was "The Makers Are Marching Again. Can It Last This Time?" And these are questions which I've written and do write on a weekly basis. Link in this description below for previous months and months and months, indeed years of these articles and questions. All completed courtesy of David Smith's articles, which he writes every Sunday. Okay, so you can see the questions on the screen in front of you. So without further ado, let's just crack on with answering them. So question one, with reference to both charts, describe how the manufacturing industry has bounced back during the first months of 2021. I'm actually not going to say too much about that because it's very obvious from reading the data on the chart. David refers in his article to the Purchasing Managers Index. And if you have a look at that and see what he says with regard to the index rising above 50, you'll be able to very easily describe and compare the data for the recent months, particularly the first few months of 2021. Obviously, as one would expect, we're seeing quite a significant bounce back as economies globally start to reopen. So that this is not just a phenomenon in the UK, this is also a global phenomenon. So question two, Rishi Sunak's 130% super deduction allowance for investment appears to be making a difference. Using ADAS diagram, analyze the macroeconomic benefits associated with the investment. So going all the way back to just early March, wasn't it, when Chancellor Sunak introduced and talked through the policies in his most recent budget. One of those policies focused upon this notion of a 130% super deduction for investment. So in other words, for every £1 that a firm invests, the government will give them £1.30 back in return. So it's a very generous offering from the government's point of view, intended to stimulate investment. And obviously there are implications for the macroeconomy. Now you can see here I've talked about George Osborne, former Chancellor, of course, during the coalition government headed up by David Cameron. And in George Osborne's 2011 budget speech, he referred to a Britain held aloft by the March of the Makers, really talking about the recovery of the UK economy post-financial crash. And here we can see the charts that I referred to in the previous question one. Just a point there, I've noted that perhaps this is just an inevitable statistical rebound. Obviously, when you're comparing data, looking at the doldrums of the economy last year, comparing them to today's numbers, well, inevitably, you're going to get a very significant statistical rebound. So it's worth bearing in mind that perhaps we're just getting back to normal, quote unquote, levels of manufacturing compared to seeing something remarkable happening in the economy. With regard to the question I've just discussed, it's important to think about investment and the implications on the macroeconomy. So obviously, investment impacts AD, C plus I, so there's the investment component, plus G plus X minus M. So we'd be expecting to see some sort of impact on the aggregate demand side of the economy. But also here we can see that it also affects long-run aggregate supply, your productive potential, your productive capacity. And so if investment into the economy is rising, then the productive potential should be expanding, or at least, as we've just mentioned, getting back to quote-unquote normal levels, back to levels that we saw kind of prior to the pandemic. And you may wish to illustrate that by way of a diagram. So here I've drawn a very straightforward ASAD diagram, and you can see we're starting at A, equilibrium point A. Aggregate demand shifts to the right because of that impact on the aggregate demand side of the economy. And then we've also got those longer term investment impacts feeding in via the aggregate supply side of the economy, shifting AS to the right. So we end up going A to B to C. So in the longer term, we might see real output rising from Y1 to Y2. And of course, you can then talk about all the longer term impacts on the macroeconomy in terms of unemployment, in terms of economic growth, in terms of inflation, all of those macroeconomic targets, which you should be focusing upon whenever you're talking about macroeconomics, particularly when you're answering extended answers on the macroeconomy. Okay, question 3. Let's just flick back to it. Briefly outline the travails currently being suffered by Britain's steel sector. Very interesting what's going on in the UK steel sector at the moment. And I've just put a little link here to a previous Sunday Times article. You don't have to look at this on the Sunday Times because, of course, that's behind a kind of paid-for firewall. However, if you look and research and Google Sanjeev Gupta, you'll see that it's a very complicated financing deal that's going on here with regard to the steel industry in the UK. And obviously concerns are quite widespread at the moment with regard to the survival and the financial viability of some of these steel plants within the UK. So just in terms of employment and unemployment and kind of those regional unemployment factors which may kick in should things not go too well for Mr. Gupta, then that's a great article to look at and just something that you should know and be aware of as you work through your studies of the macroeconomy. And then finally, using an ADAS diagram, analyse how Brexit and the Suez blockage are injecting more inflationary pressures into the economy. So it may not be widespread in the news anymore and any longer, but of course the Suez blockage did create rather a bottleneck, and that's obviously still feeding through into the economy. We've also got the implications of Brexit and the difficulties of getting things in and out of the country at the moment. We see on the news this morning as well, the service sector is now starting to really feel the pinch with regard to the fact that perhaps savings weren't front and centre in terms of the Brexit negotiations. And that's really starting to hamper, particularly, for example, touring bands and entertainments as well, who can't just get up and go to a gig or something in mainland Europe anymore. So with regard to this question, inflation, there are a couple of things that you may want to think about. So first of all, the UK savings ratio, as you know, there's a great graphic. I should have included it here, but I didn't get to look at it in time. It was in yesterday's Sunday Times with regard to, I think UK savings are now up to kind of unprecedented level, something like 1.7 trillion now kind of being hoarded by UK households. And of course, that is set to be unleashed, one would think, at least a certain proportion of it, unleashing that pent-up demand and consequently aggregate demand set to shift right as we're showing here. So 81 to 82 via that obviously consumption C plus I plus T plus X minus M, the C component. And then we've got these supply side factors which are feeding in terms of the Suez blockage, the Brexit problems, the problems getting goods in and out of the country. And again, that's feeding into the supply side of the economy, increasing costs for firms and shifting AS to the left. So we've got this kind of double whammy effect where we've got kind of demand side inflationary pressures pushing prices up and also the supply side pressures. So here we're starting from equilibrium point A, moving to B, but then ultimately up to C as both the demand and supply side factors and pressures feed through into the real economy. So I hope that's been of use, ladies and gentlemen. This is primarily really for my students who are working through the David Smith questions this week. But obviously, if you're in another centre and you're perhaps preparing for exams, then this would be good preparation, good revision for things on, obviously, demand, supply side factors, that type of thing. Okay, that's it for now, and bye for now.